Page number 158. Professor Choudhury compares these two poets in three important respects. He finds in their lyrical poetry several points of great historical interest. One of these, the most important are: 1. The reasons for the dislike of their odes, entertained by a considerable portion of contemporary English society, represented by such critics as Johnson and Goldsmith. Number 2. The particular character of their lyrical poetry viewed in mutual relation. Number 3. Their place in English poetry as determined by their relation to the Romantic movement in England. I am reading this part again. Professor Choudhury compares these two poets in three important respects. He finds in their lyrical poetry several points of great historical interest. Of these, the most important are: 1. The reasons for the dislike of their odes, entertained by a considerable portion of contemporary English society, represented by such critics as Johnson and Goldsmith. Number 2. The particular character of their lyrical poetry viewed in mutual relation. And number 3. Their place in English poetry as determined by their relation to the Romantic movement in England. Gray and Collins as lyric poets. As to the position of Gray and Collins as lyric poets, the opinion of Hazlitt represents the views of those who regard Collins as superior. He says, Collins had that genuine inspiration which alone can give birth to the highest efforts of poetry. He leaves in the minds of the readers certain traces of thought and feelings which never wear out, because nature had left them in his own mind. He is sometimes affected, unmeaning and obscure, but he also catches rich glimpses of the bowers of paradise, and has lofty aspirations after the highest seats of the muses. In his best works there is an Attic simplicity, a pathos and fervour of imagination. I should conceive that Collins has a much greater poetical genius than Gray. He had more of that fine madness which is inseparable from it, of its turbid effervescence, of all that pushes it to the verge of agony of rapture. The concluding lines of Hazlitt's remark show that he regarded Collins as a greater lyrical poet than Gray. Collins was certainly superior to Gray in lyrical and emotional content. His odes are superior to those of Gray. There is no doubt in his eclogues, Eclogues, Collins is inferior to the other poetic composition of Gray. It has been said that Collins of the Odes, at his best, is the poet of all time in general and no time in particular. The Collins of the Eclogues is everywhere the poetess of the 18th century. The odes of Collins retrieve his position and make him superior to Gray in respect of lyricism and emotional power. But Gray is the superior to Collins in architectural design and ornament in poetry. It does not mean that Collins has no design or ornament, but as a finished workman, Collins is more open to reproach. It is worth noting that both Gray and Johnson blame him on just the same grounds. Collins' structure and diction are often obscure and unintelligible. His images, words, and phrases are often carelessly chosen. These defects are not found in Gray. Every word and every phrase is carefully chosen, and every allusion, however for it may be, lie below the surface, is intelligible even in the Bard, which was generally regarded as obscure in his age. The excellence of Gray consists in the glittering array of ideas and phrases in which each of his odes is made to march with the strictest economy towards the end designed. The evolution of his odes is perfect. Gray and Collins are the two last lyrical poets of England whose art is consciously directed and held in check by the pseudo-classic school of the early 18th century. Both of them, who were alive to the rising school of Romanticism, but in both, to a very great extent, the romantic impulse was suppressed by their much greater consciousness and their spirit of Greek and Roman literature. Minor poets of the revival. We have chosen the 5 preceding poets, Gray, Goldsmith, Cowper, Burns, and Blake, as the most typical and the most interesting of the writers who proclaimed the dawn of Romanticism in the 18th century. With them we associate a group of minor writers whose works were immensely popular in their own day. The ordinary reader will pass them by, but to the student they are all significant as expressions of very different phases of the Romantic revival. James Thomson, 1700 to 1748. Thomson belongs among the pioneers of Romanticism. Like Gray and Goldsmith, he wavered between pseudo-classic and the new romantic ideals, and for this reason, if for no other, his early work is interesting, like the uncertainty of a child who hesitates whether to creep safely on all fours or to risk a fall by walking. He is worthy to be remembered for 3 poems: Rule Britannia, which is still one of the national songs of England, the Castle of Indolence, and the Seasons. The dreamy and romantic castle, occupied by enchanter Indolence and his willing captives in the land of drowsy head, is purely Spenserian in its imagery and is written in the Spenserian stanza. The Seasons 1726 to 1730, written in blank verse, describes the sights and sounds of the changing year and the poet's own feeling in the presence of nature. End of page number 158, now page number 159. These 2 poems, though rather dull to a modern reader, were significant of the early Romantic revival in 3 ways. They abandoned the prevailing heroic couplet and they went back to the Elizabethans instead of to Pope for their models, and they called attention to the long neglected life of nature as a subject of poetry. William Collins, 1721 to 1759. Collins, the disciple of Thomson, was of delicate, nervous temperament. Like Cowper, and over him also brooded the awful shadow of insanity. His first work, Oriental Eclogues of 1742, is a romantic in feeling, but is written in the prevailing mechanical couplets. All his later work is romantic in both thought and expression. His ode on the popular superstitions of the Highlands in 1750 is an interesting event in the Romantic revival, for it introduced a new world of witches, pygmies, fairies, and medieval kings for the imagination to play in. Collins's best known poems are the odes to simplicity, to fear, to the passions. The little unnamed lyric beginning, "How sleep the brave," and the exquisite ode to evening is evening. In reading the latter, one is scarcely aware that the lines are so delicately balanced that they have no need of rhyme to accentuate their melody. George Crabbe, Crabbe, 1754 to 1832. Crabbe is an interesting combination of realism and romanticism. His work of depicting common life, at times vaguely suggestive of Fielding's novels. The Village, a poem without a rival as a picture of the working men of his age, is sometimes like Fielding in its coarse vigor, and again like Dryden in its precise versification. The poem was not successful at first, and Crabbe abandoned his literary dreams. For over 20 years he settled down as a clergyman in a country parish, observing keenly the common life about him. Then he published more poems exactly like The Village, which immediately brought him fame and money. They brought him also the friendship of Walter Scott, who, like others, regarded Crabbe as one of the first poets of the age. These later poems, The Parish Register, The Borough, Tales of Verse, and The Tales of Hall, are in the same strain. They are written in couplets. They contain much that is sordid and dull, but are nevertheless real pictures of real men and women, just as Crabbe saw them, and as such they are still interesting. Goldsmith and Burns had idealized the poor, and we admire them for their sympathy and insight. It remained for Crabbe to show that in wretched fishing villages, in the lives of hard-working men and women, children, laborers, smugglers, paupers, all sorts and conditions of common men, there is abundant romantic interest without exaggerating or idealizing their vices and virtues. James Macpherson, 1736 to 1796. In Macpherson, we have an unusual figure who catered to the new romantic interest in the old epic heroes, and won immense though monetary fame by a series of literary forgeries. Macpherson was a Scottish schoolmaster, an educated man, but evidently not over tender of conscience, whose imagination had been stirred by certain old poems which he may have heard in Gaelic among the Highlanders. In 1760, he published his Fragments of Ancient Poetry collected in the Highlands, and alleged that his work was but a translation of Gaelic manuscripts. Whether the work of itself would have attracted attention is doubtful, but the fact that an abundance of literary material might be awaiting discovery led to an interest such as now attends the opening of an Egyptian tomb, and a subscription was promptly raised in Edinburgh to send Macpherson through the Highlands to collect more manuscripts. The result was the epic Fingal in 1762, that lank and lamentable counterfeit of poetry, as Swinburne calls it, which the author professed to have translated from the Gaelic of the poet Ossian. Its success was astonishing, and Macpherson followed it up with the Temora, another epic in the same strain. In both these works, Macpherson succeeds in giving an air of primal grandeur to his heroes. The characters are big and shadowy. The imagery is at times magnificent. The language is a kind of chanting, bombastic prose. Now Fingal arose in his might, and thrice he dared his voice. Cromla answered around, and the sons of the desert stood still. They bent their red faces to earth, ashamed at the presence of Fingal. He came like a cloud of rain in the days of the sun, when slow it rolls in the hill, and fields expect the shower. Swaran beheld the terrible king of Morven, and stopped in the midst of his course. Dark he leaned on his spear, rolling his red eyes around. Silent and tall, he seemed as an oak on the banks of Lubar, which had its branches blasted of old by the lighting of heaven. His thousands pour around the hero, and the darkness of battle gathers on the hill. End of page 159. Now page 160. The publication of this gloomy, imaginative work produced a literary storm. A few critics, led by Dr. Johnson, demanded to see the original manuscripts, and when Macpherson refused to produce them, the oceanic poems were branded as forgery. Nevertheless, they had enormous success. Macpherson was bound as a literary was honored as a literary explorer. He was given an official position, carrying a salary for life, and at his death in 1796 he was buried in Westminster Abbey. Blake, Burns, and indeed most of the poets of the age were influenced by this sham poetry. Even the scholarly Gray was deceived and delighted with Ossian, and men as far apart as Goethe and Napoleon praised it immoderately.